Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. I appreciate you being with me. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Hey, first of all, don't forget, July 12th through 14th, Ardmore, Oklahoma, Preterist Pilgrim Weekend. Our theme is getting back to the basics. What are the basics of covenant eschatology? We got a great lineup of speakers, great topics. You don't want to miss this. Okay, well, as promised, and I have been asked to do a review and a response to the book by Joel Richardson. The book is entitled Mystery Babylon, Unlocking the Bible's Greatest Prophetic Mystery. And Mr. Richardson, quite frankly, is a very good writer. His style is easy to read. It's, shall we say, entertaining. And there's at the very outset of the book, I must say, I really enjoyed some of what he shared. The introduction, as it were, of the book is somewhat helpful as he sets out to define and to identify Babylon of Revelation. What he does initially is to share with us the history of different interpretations for who Babylon of Revelation was. Of course, Babylon had been identified down through the years as Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, Islam in the 14th, 15th centuries. In more modern times, New York City, Eastern European Common Market, and what have you. And so that's a good rundown on giving us the history of interpretation of who Babylon of Revelation is. Another thing that I personally found very helpful and fascinating, it's kind of in my wheelhouse, is that Mr. Richardson shared some really fascinating, very interesting comments on Nimrod that is mentioned in the book of Genesis. And he shares with us many of the apocryphal traditions about Nimrod and his influence. And Mr. Richardson actually does a pretty good job of showing that many commentators have drawn some entirely false conclusions about, number one, who he was, number two, about his influence, number three, about the relationship between Nimrod and Babylon of Revelation. And he shows that those traditions, those stories, have no biblical merit. They have no biblical support whatsoever, and that from a purely hermeneutical perspective, we have no right to jump in and to say, oh, well, look at all these legends about Nimrod, and Nimrod's influence. You know, he's a great hunter in the earth, and he established cities, and et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, he must be responsible for Babylon, i.e. confusion, in the book of Revelation. Well, that's a humongous leap, if you please, a logical fallacy there, and it is one of anachronism. And this is where I begin to find fault with Mr. Richardson's book. And as I'm going to share with you over the next several weeks, the fallacy of Mr. Richardson's book is this, and this is somewhat paradoxical, or perhaps a better word is ironic. Mr. Richardson sets out in the book, and he calls attention to this interpretation and that interpretation, and said, we must not go beyond the biblical testimony. We must employ proper hermeneutic. Well, amen to that. I'm all about proper hermeneutic. And then, strangely enough, revealingly enough, Mr. Richardson will go along in his comments about a historical situation that existed 3,000 years ago. He will cite verses from the Old Testament that gave place names, nation names, that existed at that time and that existed in the days of the prophecies of that time. And then Mr. Richardson jumps forward in time to our day and our time, and applies those prophecies to our day and our time. And thus, while Mr. Richardson says we must honor proper hermeneutic, while Mr. Richardson says we must not go beyond the biblical text, he goes far, far beyond the biblical text and identifies the countries and the kingdoms, the nations that existed 2,000 years ago, such as Moab, the Ammonites, and the Amalekites. We'll have more to say about this later. And he says, now watch this. Those nations, those kingdoms, are the current Islamic nations. No, they're not. Now, I'll simply mention this here, but I'll develop it more. I'll document it later. The Moabite nation, springing from Lot and Noah, down through that lineage, the Moabites, as virtually all historians agree, the Moabites ceased to exist in 582 BC, in fulfillment, by the way, of Ezekiel chapter 25, and here again is one of Mr. Richardson's hermeneutical fallacies, one of his logical fallacies. He goes to Ezekiel chapter 25, the list of nations that is given there. He extrapolates from those nations that existed at that time the names of those nations and kingdoms that existed at that time. Completely overlooks the fact that Ezekiel chapter 25, and I'm getting ahead of myself right here because I'm going to document this thoroughly for you in a later video. Even though Ezekiel chapter 25 specifically says that it was Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Babylonians, that was going to destroy those nations, Mr. Richardson, in his book, says, well, those nations that are named there are current Islamic nations, and they will be destroyed in the end times. After the Antichrist takes them over, uses them for his purposes, then at the coming of the Lord, they're all going to be destroyed. Folks, that is a humongous anachronistic hermeneutic. It completely ignores what the text says. And as we proceed in this review of Mr. Joel Richardson's book, you are going to see one logical fallacy after another, one hermeneutical fallacy after another. You are going to see his anachronistic hermeneutic absolutely dominates everything that he says. His presuppositional theology, which he says we must avoid presuppositional assumptions about what the text says. Well, amen and amen. But no one is more guilty of presuppositional theology and imposing those presuppositions on the text than Mr. Joel Richardson. Mr. Richardson's view is that Babylon of Revelation is nothing other than Islam and the Caliphate. I believe that is so presuppositional. I believe that is so anachronistic. I believe that goes so far beyond the actual biblical text as to have zero credibility. It completely ignores the emphatic statements of both the Old Testament, the New Testament, and specifically the book of Revelation. You know, I've written my own book on who is this Babylon. Now, mind you, I once believed that Babylon was Rome or the Roman Catholic Church. I believed that with all of my heart. I began to honestly study the text for myself. I began to discover, number one, that the traditional dating of the book of Revelation that I had been taught, that I had accepted, the late date for the book of Revelation, had virtually zero evidence to support it. Zero. I mean, I was amazed at how weak the evidence was. I then began to study what Revelation actually says about Babylon, and it blew me away. And so this book, which has gone through about 3 different printings now and revisions, is my explanation, my offering to you of who is this Babylon. And it is none other than Old Covenant, 1st century Jerusalem. Now, obviously, Mr. Richardson and I stand at polar opposites in this regard. And I will be sharing with you why I believe Mr. Richardson's view that Babylon of Revelation was Islam of our modern day to be destroyed at the future coming of the Lord is completely false. Okay, this is our first installment. We'll have installment number 2, Lord willing, next Friday. Thanks for joining me. Get yourself a copy of my book. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Purchase the book. Let me know you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook. Your total price will be $19.95. Thanks again. We'll see you next week.